Very pleased to meet you. My name is Nina Scherbak. I am Associate Professor of the English Department of St. Petersburg State University. And today we are going to talk about Oxbridge and its literary tradition. I would like to start my presentation not just talking about Oxford and about those writers that come from Oxford and Cambridge, those writers that devoted their literary works to Oxford and Cambridge. I'd like to speak a little bit about what Britain is in terms of its political, cultural and educational system. So just a few words that I will relate to Oxford and Cambridge a bit later. So if you look at political power of Britain, you see the connection between House of Commons and House of Lords as showing to what extent the power of kings is related to parliamentary power. And you vividly and explicitly see it in a very well-known ceremony, which is called a state opening of the Parliament, that you see in this picture. It's a ceremony when the Queen comes to the House of Lords and actually opens the Parliament. But when she opens the Parliament, she has to read the speech prepared to her by the Prime Minister. And she commands the Black Rod, this very person, Black Rod, to walk to the House of Commons and invite them. And when the Black Rod walks, the door is slammed into his face. This is to show that though everyone goes into the House of Lords to listen to the speech prepared by the Queen, it is still the House of Commons that decide now. So in this ceremony, you very well see how the power of monarchs, the power of the king, was transferred to the power of the Commons. So you see here in the face of the Black Rod that the door is slammed into his face. So the House of Commons show that they have more power. So actually what it shows is that for some time British history was about the power of kings, and at some point you got the power that is elected, you get parliamentary power that is important. So if you look at famous monarchs, you have of course the famous Henry VIII, who is famous for his 6 wives and for establishing Anglican Church. He was married to Catherine of Aragon, and then he asked the Pope to get a divorce because he wanted to have a boy, an heir apparent. But the Pope refused, so he proclaimed and established Anglican Church, which would allow the king to be married for the 2nd time. And he married a very glamorous woman of the times, a very educated woman, a very intelligent woman, Anne Boleyn, who was actually educated at a French court. She studied for 8 years. And she moved to Britain, and she, though she was lady-in-waiting at some point for Henry VIII, she became his wife. And she was executed because at some point she started interfering into internal and external, into foreign affairs. So Henry VIII executed her. But from those times you get Anglican Church that slowly develops, and a different part in the history of Britain that starts. Though Anne Boleyn, everyone expects her to give birth to a boy, she gives birth to a girl. But she gives birth to a girl who becomes one of the most powerful queens of her times, Elizabeth I. Elizabeth I is famous for developing very strong connection with the New World. She sends people to the New World. She sends pirates to the New World. She has the famous Francis Drake, who brings gold from the New World back to Britain. She manages, and that is what she's famous for, establish very clever, very intelligent customs systems with the New World. Virginia, one of the American states, is named after the Virgin Queen Elizabeth. She's called the Virgin Queen because she is never married. She has many favorites, but she never gets married. And she's a very strong woman. When she dies, she actually doesn't go to her bed. She stands for 1 or 2 days in front of the window, and then she just collapses and dies. So you get personality like Elizabeth I in the history of Great Britain. Then you get a very famous king. His name is James I. He is a king who comes from Scotland. he comes with his favorites. He's a very educated king. He's one of the kings that really transfers Anglican Church into something new. He devotes a lot of time to publishing his own James I Bible. In other words, he translates the Bible from Latin into English. He also falls at his coronation because he is always in the clouds in his own thoughts. He writes about a lot of academic articles about alchemy. He has a famous favorite, Earl Somerset, that supports him. In his presence, you get Francis Bacon, the one who started inductive method of science, a very famous personality that even sits in prison instead of James I. So you get a lot of famous figures around James I. You get a famous story of how James I wants to establish peace with Spain, so he sends his child, Charles I, his son, he sends to Spain with Earl Buckingham, in the hope that his son could marry Spanish Infante. But it never happens. He never marries Infante, he refuses. But you get so many different activities that James I undertakes. And of course, he's very famous for having his connection with Shakespeare. He encouraged Shakespeare to put up plays. He encouraged the play Macbeth to be released and staged. So you get very many interesting points about James I. And of course, what we started with, James I as a monarch managed to maintain very close connection with the parliament. He managed to have very diplomatic connection with the parliament. He never quarreled with the parliament. Unlike his son, Charles I, who not only quarreled with the parliament, but he allowed such laws to be passed that allowed to behead him. So he's the first king that actually was beheaded. So from those times when Oliver Cromwell beheaded Charles I, you actually get the start of the parliamentary power that becomes much more influential than the power of the king. And of course, when you talk about Oxford and Cambridge, from those times you get the name of James I mentioned, because James I allowed the parliament to have certain sittings at Oxford. And during the reign of Charles I, you also get a very strong connection of the monarchs with Oxford and Cambridge. You also get a famous monarch, Queen Victoria, that is the queen that ruled the country in the times of its prosperity. The 19th century is the times when Britain owned 2/3 of the whole world. It's the times of expansion. It's the times when Queen Victoria said that India is the biggest, most wonderful diamond in her crown. Victorian times are famous for having double standards because Victoria proclaimed having very pure relationship with her family. And at the same time, in London, there was a lot of poverty, child labor was used, there were a lot of brothels, so you have many misdemeanors at that time in London. But at the same time, you have enormous development of science in the times of Victoria. You have enormous exhibitions that take place in Hyde Park, during which Britain shows its inventions and its discoveries, and actually manifests the glory of the United Kingdom. So moving on from telling you that there has always been a connection between the power of a monarch and parliamentary power, we could look at peculiarities of judicial power in Britain. Judicial power is famous for having barristers who are educated in Inns of Court. So barristers are these secluded kind of people who are well trained, and they are the core of the judicial system, which in Britain is very flexible. It is based on common law. You don't have criminal or civil code in Britain. You have precedents and statutes. So judicial system allows certain classes to dominate, and though the system is very fair, you could still see that there is a lot of class tension because judicial system is based on this class system. And though precedents allow the system to be very flexible, you still get a lot of cases when the case could be swing into this or that favor just because people belong to certain class or certain social group. Educational system in some ways is similar because you get traditionally schools that are private schools, the so-called independent schools or public schools, and they account for 5% of all the schools in Britain. And traditionally you would get those people who study there and they get very traditional education. They get, they have Latin and Greek, they have a lot of sports in this school. I'm talking about schools like Eton or Marlborough, schools where traditionally you have a lot of sport and a lot of character training. And these schools were actually a good foundation for people to occupy later very prestigious positions in the society, to become high court judges, ambassadors, even without the university. And only at the end of the 19th century you get actually understanding that public school boys, they still have to get higher education to study at Oxford and Cambridge, for instance. So you get here understanding that Oxford and Cambridge, of course, it has a very good reputation, but it is the reputation not only of very beautiful universities, medieval universities, 12th, 13th century universities, but they are also universities that are very prestigious. So they are actually a very vivid manifestation of the class division system. Now, if you look at literature, you get famous examples of who actually described Oxford and Cambridge in their literary work. So you get names like Geoffrey Chaucer, famous Geoffrey Chaucer, who wrote his Canterbury Tales, in which he writes, in the Middle Ages, he writes about misdemeanors in monasteries. He laughs at monasteries, but at the same time he describes Oxford Don, who is riding a very poor and slim horse. So Oxford Don is not just a person who is very glamorous or clever. It's a person who is quite in the clouds, a person who is isolated from the rest of the world. So certainly academic world is not pictured as only positive world. It's pictured as quite a silly world of being very clever. And in English, if you look at the word clever, clever is actually, it's not clever as it is in Russian. Clever could be too clever. And for British culture to be too clever is not very good. In the famous story by George Mike's, How to be an Alien, the author describes a story of how a British girl, she's not supposed to know what is the capital of Romania. And when she's asked where are those islands, she could just say, oh, those little islands, are they British? So the idea of being too clever in Britain is not something that one should be proud of. So because Oxford and Cambridge by definition are clever, these are not the universities that the public and cultural scene looks always in admiration at. So if you look at Oxbridge, it's two universities that are very close to London. Medieval universities, extremely beautiful, with the famous Bodleian Library that is situated in Oxford. It's two universities that have examinations for their students only at the very beginning and at the very end. It's also the university where students study only for 8 weeks. At a university where I was a student at Lancaster University, we would have 10 weeks. At Oxford and Cambridge, you get just 8 weeks, which is a semester, so you study less. You also have tutorial system. It means that you meet with your tutor on a one-to-one basis, and you have to produce an assignment once a week, and the rest of the time you go for lectures. And also, of course, Oxford and Cambridge is famous for its famous graduates, famous alumni, and for the fact that they have colleges. So it's not faculties or departments that the university is divided into, it's colleges. Each college college has a quadrangle, a very beautiful courtyard. It has a hostel where students study. It has a beautiful church. So it's like a separate institution, separate building with its own life. Colleges compete. Colleges have their famous alumni and graduates. So you have this life of Oxford and Cambridge, which is a higher educational system, but at the same time, in a way, they stand apart from the rest of the nation. So if you look at literature, one of the most famous and beautiful examples of describing Oxford is Brideshead Revisited. It's a novel that was written by Evelyn Waugh and published in 1945. And it tells you the story of a Catholic family, a very upper-class Catholic family that sends their child to Oxford. So on the right you see Sebastian Flyte, the son of this family, one of the children, and on the left you see Charles Ryder. He is like the author, the onlooker, his friend. So you get this picture of Oxford just before the war, the generation of old boys who don't go to lectures, who enjoy understanding life as it is. You see pictures of Oxford and how they drink wine, how they are dressed in tuxedo, and how they are trying to find way out of boredom of Oxford life. You have Blake's poetry that is one of the main leitmotifs of this novel. And Blake has a series of poems which are called Songs of Innocence and Experience. So innocence and experience, these are two notions that are actually the core of this novel, because innocence is your university life, whereas experience is your real life. So Oxford, in a way, is this innocence of younger students that start their life with a lot of expectations. So it is shown in a very beautiful way, and though the book was actually written in order to say how Catholic families are terrible because they dictate their children what to do, they have their very strict rules, but at the same time, the book produced a very charming impression on the readers. They produced such a charming impression that it was not only the book that was beloved by many generations, but it was a book about farewell with British Athens. British Athens is a term that is given to this book because it describes Oxford and Cambridge with its tradition of single-sex colleges, with its love for Plato, with its love for your peer students, with your love for beauty, for poetry, for all those Oscar Wilde kind of traditions that were quite famous at Oxford at some point. So the book is extremely beautiful. The film that was shown, a screen version, or the famous screen version of this film, was released in 1981. You get very famous actors playing there, including Sir Laurence Olivier and Gielgud, John Gielgud. And the film was shot actually on location in the very beautiful Howard Castle that you could visit in Britain, and a real aristocratic family continues living there, but they have 2 or 3 rooms devoted to the shooting that is still there since the year of when it was shot, 1981. Now you have a new version of this book, screen version of the year 2008, where you get a more simplified picture. But it is still about Oxford. It's about the generation of Oxford just before Second World War. And it's called Brideshead Revisited because the main character comes during the war, during World War II. He comes to Brideshead and remembers. He remembers how he was. He remembers how Sebastian Flyte, this boy you see on the left, how he was looking into the book and saying, who could enjoy the beauty of a butterfly more than the beauty of a Catholic cathedral? He would say, I can. I'm this person, I'm a student of Oxford who could enjoy the beauty of a butterfly more than the beauty of a Catholic cathedral. Another famous phrase he says, is he goes into a beautiful orchard with his friend, and he drinks champagne with strawberries, which is very aristocratic, Oxford-like of those times behavior of an old boy. And he says a very funny phrase. He says, "I'd like to bury something precious in any place I've been happy in. And then when I'm old and miserable, come back, dig it up and remember." So it's all about people's memories. It's all about innocence and experience. And it's all about Oxford that allows you not just to study lectures, but to study culture and life and philosophy and something else beyond it. And of course, Sebastian that you see with the teddy bear, and the teddy bear is an allusion to Lord Byron, who went to Cambridge University but had a real bear in his room. Another very famous personality of Oxford life is, of course, Iris Murdoch, a famous British author that went to Oxford and who was an Oxford Don for a very long time. At Oxford and Cambridge, you have dons and you have ladies and gentlemen. They have a very famous tradition of having their gowns that are put on when you go to your evening meal. And at the university where I was a student, at Lancaster University, you would get Princess Alexandra, who was the rector of our university. So you have not the queen, but her cousin being the rector of the university. So it's all connected. It's all related, like kings and queens, Oxford and Cambridge, in some way, though it is now much more democratic. At Oxford and Cambridge, you have a lot of overseas students, but you still have this tradition. So Iris Murdoch was manifesting in her personality new trends, new developments. She was a feminist. She was a philosopher. She wrote a lot about Sartre. She had many relationships that were very open. She wrote 28 novels, and she was having. She would say this wonderful phrase that is very picturesque and very maybe characteristic of Oxford. She would say that the only freedom one could have is the freedom of one's mind. So it's about your free mind. She lost her mind at the end of her life. She had a very tragic sort of story. And her husband, John Bailey, a famous, not a very famous writer, but also an English, Oxford Don. He studied, he lectured on English literature. He wrote 2 books in which he described life of Iris Murdoch. And he described her glamorous years, and he described how she was completely disabled when she lost her memory and had a mental illness. So a lot of people would not support of this book, but there was a famous screen version of this film, of this book, that John Bailey, her husband, wrote. And this is the screen version in which Kate Winslet and Judi Dench managed to play, that describes the life of Iris. In the picture you have famous theaters. It's actually the pictures I took in London and my friend's house. I'd like you to just to see bits, glimpses of Iris Murdoch's novels. One of them is Black Prince, and of course in the title you hear and understand the allusion to Shakespeare. So Iris Murdoch would refer to Shakespeare, to Hamlet, by this reference to Black Prince. But of course, main character of her novel is not Hamlet. It's a younger girl who loves a man who is much older than she is, the brother of her father. And you get all the possible triangles of Shakespeare that are made into Iris Murdoch's Black Prince novel. Iris Murdoch, of course, is a very postmodern writer, having allusions to Shakespeare and playing with different ciphers, different patterns of older works, making them anew. So Black Prince is direct reference to Shakespeare. Iris Murdoch, of course, is famous for putting into light, shedding light on people's affairs, showing how difficult and complicated people's psychology could be, that we could fall in love with different people regardless of the rules of the society. So she made enormous contribution into discovering people's personalities in this respect. Another famous Oxford graduate is Graham Greene, who was an ambassador. He worked at some point in Portugal. He's also an Oxford graduate. Portugal is famous for not participating in First World War and Second World War, so Graham Greene managed to work there for intelligence service. He also was great friend of the USSR. At some point he broke away from the USSR, but he supported the Soviet Union at different times, and his works were quite popular. His famous story, Dr. Fisher from Geneva, is about a diplomat. So you see and hear it in the title, and it tells you about beautiful men and beautiful women, and you see they're aristocrats that went to good universities. Another famous novel by Graham Greene is The Quiet American, that actually tells you the story about Vietnam, and you have a British character, British diplomat, that falls in love with a Vietnamese woman, and it completely, American character. Graham Greene completely ruins the idea about Vietnam War because he writes about American actions. He writes about intrusion into Vietnam. He writes about the failure of the French there. So he describes war times as well as he brings colonial figures, British-American figures, into his novels. You have another famous character who went to Oxford, that is Terry Eagleton, who wrote a famous book, Introduction to Literature. And in this book he actually takes all the famous hermeneutics specialists, post-structuralists like Julia Kristeva, Foucault, Freud. He talks about Isa, he talks about Lacan, he talks about Kress and Hodge, he talks about Genet. So famous structuralists and post-structuralists, all the famous scientists who wrote about how you interpret the text, Terry Eagleton covers in his book. So it's very academic. It's extremely interesting, but it's very academic. So you see all those academics that you read when you read hermeneutics included in this book. So it's very much of a course for students who study literary criticism. So Terry Eagleton also went to Oxford. Now, if we move to Cambridge and speak about famous personalities of Cambridge University, you would hear a lot of names as well. So you would hear the name of Byron, you would hear the name of Vladimir Nabokov. Cambridge is similar to Oxford, but traditionally it is known more for sciences. Oxford is known for humanities, Cambridge is known for scientists. Byron notoriously lived at Cambridge with his bear. Byron wrote Childe Harold in Cambridge. Byron was the poet that belonged to a romantic school. He had many friends among romantic poets, including Wordsworth, Coleridge, Shelley, Mackinsley, who went to Oxford. Mackinsley is famous for his Confessions of an Opium Eater. It's Lake District poets who, some of them lived around Lake District in the Dove Cottage that belonged to Wordsworth. Others would go to live in Somerset. So Byron was the person who helped Coleridge to publish his famous Kubla Khan. So his name is very demonic and influential, and he also went to Cambridge. You get a famous Russian writer, Vladimir Nabokov, who loved Britain very much. He was a Russian aristocrat who was born in St. Petersburg, the one who immigrated to Berlin at some point. His father was a very famous political figure. He defended his friend in Berlin Philharmonia, and he was shot. And later, Vladimir Nabokov, Russian aristocrat, he went to Cambridge University, and in his famous novel, Memories Speak, he describes what was Oxford like, what Cambridge was like in those times. He talks about its legends. He talks about thermal underwear made of bear that you wear, a kind of poetry that I am making up. He writes about drafts that you get at Cambridge. He writes about famous unknown people in glasses that sell newspapers. So he actually touches upon the very atmosphere of Cambridge University, and I very much recommend Speak Memory because it has a lot of reminiscences to Cambridge life. Then you get a contemporary book by Peter Zager, very good book about Oxford and Cambridge and its famous personalities. So you could refer to this book because it tells you in a very academic way wonderful stories about Oxford and Cambridge. You get the story, for instance, about Oliver Cromwell and John Milton, and both of them went to Cambridge. And also in this book you get the story about the difference of Oxford and Cambridge. So you get here, for instance, words that Oxford, an ancient bastion of Catholicism, then turned into the headquarters of Charles I. So you understand that Oxford was actually the place which encouraged Catholics and those who supported Charles I to be there. Oxford is famous for its Catholics, not for Puritans. George I is one of the other kings, Georgian times, one of the first Georgian kings that was ruling in the 19th century. And in this book you get the story. George I presented a luxurious library to Oxford. He sent a cavalry regiment to Oxford in 1775. And you get again understanding, sort of difference of Oxford. So Oxford is the bastion where you get the atmosphere of laziness, whereas Cambridge is a very Puritan place. So Oxford is associated with Catholics. Oxford is associated with Charles I. Cambridge is associated with Puritans and with very pure and dry spirit. Even the rain at Oxford is drier than in Oxford. Even the rain in Cambridge is drier than in Oxford. Oxford has brighter formulations. Cambridge has deeper thoughts. Very good phrase. Yeah, Oxford has brighter formulations. Cambridge has deeper thoughts, says Benjamin Thompson, a lecturer at Somerville College. Cambridge is famous for taking everything too seriously, first of all itself. So certainly there are more differences between Oxford and Cambridge, and these are two universities that compete. But here in Peter Zager's book you have very funny examples, you have very historical examples that allow you to see the differences between these two universities. So today we just had very small glimpses of both universities, and you well understand that both universities are famous for its very many graduates. Oxford is more associated with humanities and history and philology, whereas Cambridge is associated with science. But you get famous writers that we talked about that wrote about both universities with great love and admiration. And here you have names of Evelyn Waugh, you have names of Iris Murdoch, you have names of the name of Graham Greene, Terry Eagleton. If we talk about Cambridge, you have the name of George Gordon Byron, Vladimir Nabokov, and many, many, many other writers that went to Oxford and Cambridge and contributed to its tradition. Both universities are extremely beautiful. The life there for students is well planned. They have very good libraries. Each book from around the world goes into the library in Oxford and Cambridge, and their life is centered around colleges. It's a very big attraction and a very big pride, not just of Britain but of many countries, because it's like common heritage that we could read about in books about Oxford, Oxbridge and Oxford and Cambridge tradition. And of course we still remember that both universities are very prestigious, because traditionally they were for the aristocratic class or upper middle class. Nowadays of course it's open to the to the public, but they still have bits of its glamour that sometimes we could despise and sometimes we admire, like characters of Brideshead Revisited admire Oxford with all its tradition. Thank you very much.